Emiliano Cortez was never a man of presence. Born in the dusty, forgotten alleys of Ciudad Juárez in the 1990s, his life was a long lesson in invisibility. His dwarfism made him a walking target, a repository for the casual cruelty of a world that measures a man's worth in inches. However, while others saw only his stature, Emiliano developed a keen sight, a mind that catalogued every detail, every weakness, every glance of contempt. He learned to move through the cracks of society, a silent ghost who absorbed the world without being noticed. His path to this point was not one of action, but of forced observation, an unconscious preparation for the war he did not yet know he would fight, where his greatest disadvantage would become his most lethal weapon, sharpened by the pain and humiliation of a lifetime. The neighborhood where Emiliano lived was an open wound on the Mexican border, a place where hope dried up under the merciless sun faster than puddles of rain. The dirt streets were labyrinths of despair, lined with makeshift houses that seemed to shrink under the weight of their own existence. The police drove through with their windows closed, ignoring the screams and whispers, leaving the law in the hands of men like El Sombra. Stories like Emiliano's are born and die in these places every day, invisible to the rest of the world. If this story touches you, know that it is a reflection of many others lost in the shadows. If we can reach 1,000 subscribers, we can continue to give a voice to these silenced narratives. Comment where you're watching from so we know how far the echo of Juárez has managed to reach, and help us honor these memories. The architect of Emiliano's daily misery was Ricardo Morales, known on the streets as El Sombra. He was the personification of the brutality that thrived in that environment. To El Sombra, Emiliano was not a person, but an object of amusement, a punching bag to relieve the boredom between one crime and the next. The bullying he inflicted was a public performance, a theater of power for his gang and the terrorized community. Every insult, every shove, every cruel laugh taught Emiliano a valuable lesson about the mechanics of cruelty. He learned that El Sombra's power came not from strength, but from the fear he inspired, and that even the most feared predators had weaknesses that could be exploited by anyone with the patience and courage to observe them in the shadows. Amidst this darkness, the only light in Emiliano's life was his younger sister, Ana. She was his opposite in almost everything, vibrant, fearless, and with an unshakable faith in her brother's goodness. While the world made him small, Ana saw him as a giant, a silent protector with the strongest soul she knew. It was she who confronted the bullies with a fury that belied her young age, who cleaned the blood from his knees and the dust from his clothes, promising that one day they would leave that place. The love between them was a sanctuary, a small piece of heaven in the middle of hell. Ana was not just his family, she was the guardian of his humanity, the constant reminder that behind the victim's facade there was a man worthy of love and respect. Emiliano's survival in the neighborhood depended on his ability to become part of the scenery. He knew every alley, every rooftop, every secret passage that cut through the blocks. He mapped the routines of the criminals and the absence of the police. His mind became a detailed archive of the hidden life of that place. He saw the deals being closed on dark corners, the exchange of packages, the way fear altered people's posture. This constant observation, born from the need to avoid pain, was transforming into a form of power. He possessed no physical strength, but he accumulated knowledge, an invisible weapon that no one, especially El Sombra, could even imagine he was forging in silence with every humiliation he endured. The final humiliation occurred on a Saturday afternoon in the heart of the local market. El Sombra and his men cornered Emiliano not to rob him, but for the pure pleasure of exercising their power. The mockery was loud, attracting a crowd of silent, helpless onlookers. They knocked him down, kicked his grocery bags, and showered him with insults that cut deeper than any blade. That's when Ana appeared. At just 16, she threw herself in front of her brother, her eyes burning with fury. She didn't scream, but her voice, firm and full of contempt, cut through the air, shaming El Sombra in front of his own men. For a moment, the predator retreated, not from the threat, but from the shock of that defiant courage. That act of love and bravery, however, sealed her fate. That night, as Ana tended to her brother's wounds, the atmosphere in their small house was one of tense calm. Emiliano was submerged in a silent fury, a rage that found no outlet. Ana held his face and told him the words that would become his compass and his curse. "You are bigger than all of them, Emmy. Your heart is bigger." She handed him a small cloth doll she always carried, a charm she had made herself. "To protect you," she said with a sad smile. That was the last moment of tenderness, the last exchange of looks not stained by blood and vengeance. It was the last time Emiliano felt human, before the outside world came to claim everything he loved. The sun set over Ciudad Juárez, painting the sky orange and purple, the colors of a bruise. The shadows stretched through the alleys like long predatory fingers, and the air grew heavy, laden with the premonition of tragedy. The cheap neon lights of the shops began to flicker, casting a sickly glow on the streets. That night, the darkness would not just be the absence of light. It would be a presence, a hungry entity about to swallow Emiliano Cortez's life whole. The silence that preceded the scream was the loudest sound he had ever heard, the sound of his world shattering forever. The night was just beginning, and with it the birth of a monster forged by the deepest pain a soul can endure. El Sombra's retaliation was not long in coming. It was not a direct confrontation, but an act of cowardly cruelty, designed to reassert his dominance through terror. That same night, as Ana returned from the pharmacy with medicine for Emiliano's injuries, the darkness of the alley swallowed her. El Sombra's men didn't say a word. The violence was sudden, impersonal, and devastating, a message written in blood so that everyone in the neighborhood would know the price of defiance. The sound of gunshots echoed through the dirt streets, a sound so common that many residents just cowered in their homes, praying that death was not knocking at their door. For Emiliano, however, that sound was the shattering of his soul, the harbinger of a silence that would last forever and transform him into something even he would not recognize. Emiliano ran toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs, a desperate prayer on his lips. He found her lying on the dusty ground, under the dim yellowish light of a lone street lamp. The world around him dissolved into a blur of incomprehensible pain. He knelt beside her, her small, fragile body now motionless. The cloth doll she had given him hours before had fallen beside her, stained with dust and a dark red. He held her hand, already growing cold, and a primitive howl of pure agony tore from his throat, an inhuman sound that contained all the pain of a lifetime of suffering, now crystallized in a single, unbearable moment of loss. In that alley, the Emiliano that had existed until then died along with his sister. The arrival of the police was a second violation. 2 officers, with expressions of boredom and indifference, treated the crime scene with the bureaucratic efficiency of someone dealing with trash. They asked routine questions, their eyes empty of any empathy, as their dirty shoes stepped near Anna's body. "Another settling of scores," one of them muttered to the other, the phrase landing on Emiliano like a punch. They didn't see a brother's pain, only another statistic for a file that would be forgotten in a drawer. The injustice of the system, the corruption that allowed monsters like El Sombra to act with impunity, was laid bare before his eyes. In that moment, he understood that the law did not exist to protect him. It existed to protect the status quo, and justice was a luxury he could not afford. The funeral was a grim, sparse event held under the punishing Juárez sun. Only a few brave neighbors and Father Mateo attended, most with their eyes lowered, afraid of being seen offering condolences to the family of one of El Sombra's victims. As the priest recited the prayers, the words sounded hollow to Emiliano. He watched the simple wooden coffin being lowered into the dry earth and felt the hatred solidify within him, filling the void left by his grief. It was no longer a hot, blind emotion, but something cold, heavy, and precise. That burial was not a farewell, it was a declaration of war. There, before the grave of his only source of light, Emiliano buried his former identity and swore that the soil of Juárez would drink the blood of those who took his sister from him. Back in his now unbearably silent home, Emiliano picked up the small cloth doll from the floor. He wiped the dark stain with his thumb, the fabric now a sacred symbol of his promise. Grief still consumed him, but it had transformed into fuel. Sadness gave way to a terrifying clarity. If the world was ruled by monsters, he would become a greater monster. If justice was blind, he would be its eyes and its blade. He would no longer hide or wait for a salvation that would never come. He decided that fear would no longer rule his life or his neighborhood. And it is because of decisions like this, born from the deepest pain, that stories like his need to be told. Subscribing to our channel is the way to ensure that the echo of these voices rising up against the darkness is never forgotten. After Ana's funeral, Emiliano Cortez vanished. To the neighborhood, his absence was just another footnote in the daily chronicle of tragedy. Most assumed he had fled, a wounded dog looking for a place to die in peace. Others, more cynical, whispered that El Sombra had finished the job, eliminating the last witness to his cruelty. No one imagined the truth. Emiliano had not fled far. He had plunged deeper into the city's bowels, finding refuge in an abandoned basement beneath a closed tortilleria. The smell of mold and damp concrete became the air of his new world, a catacomb where he would bury the man he had been to give birth to the weapon he needed to become. The world above could forget him. That was exactly what he wanted. In the gloom of his lair, lit by a single bare bulb, Emiliano began his metamorphosis. With the few savings he had, he bought old chemistry books, urban, guerrilla tactics manuals, and anatomy treatises. He wasn't training to be a soldier, he was studying to be a predator. During the day, he read obsessively, absorbing knowledge about homemade poisons, the instability of chemical compounds, and the weak points of the human body. At night, he slipped through the shadows observing. He mapped the routines, the deals, the weaknesses, and the vices of every member of El Sombra's gang. His intelligence, once a passive tool, now became a forge, shaping a meticulous and lethal plan, piece by piece. The deepest transformation, however, was happening within him. The grief that had paralyzed him gave way to a cold, efficient engine, fueled by hatred. He practiced emotional detachment, like a monk practices meditation. He looked at old photographs of Ana, not to feel the pain of loss, but to solidify his resolve, to remind himself of the price of inaction. He stopped seeing himself as Emiliano, the victim. In his reflection in the broken glass of a window, he began to see an instrument of retribution, a shadow with a singular purpose. The pain was still there, a frozen core in his chest, but now it served a purpose. It was the whetstone on which he sharpened his new identity. With his plan outlined, he began to gather the materials. They were not guns or knives, but mundane items that could be found in any market. Fertilizers, cleaning products, electrical wiring, metal pipes. In his hands, these banal objects became components of a silent and anonymous death. He chose his first target with surgical care, not one of the leaders, but the youngest henchman, the one whose laughter had been the loudest during the humiliation at the market. The planning was obsessive. He spent weeks observing the man's apartment, learning his schedule, the location of the gas tank, the air currents. There would be no room for error. The first drop of blood would be shed without anyone knowing it was murder. The first death was a whisper in the wind. Small, controlled explosion in the middle of the night, attributed to a gas leak. Emiliano's target died in his sleep, never knowing he had been judged and condemned. For Emiliano, the act was visceral and terrifying. The sound of the explosion, even from a distance, made his body tremble. The smell of burnt gas made him sick. But when the news spread the next morning as a tragic accident, a cold calm washed over him. He had done it. He had taken the first step on a path of no return. There was no satisfaction, no relief, only the grim confirmation that he was capable of becoming what he needed to be. One by one, they would pay. The second target was one of El Sombra's lookouts, a man known for his addiction to cheap tequila. This time, Emiliano's method was even more subtle. During one of his nightly incursions, he tampered with a bottle he knew the man would drink, using a chemical mixture that would simulate fulminant liver failure. 2 days later, the man was found dead at his post, the empty bottle beside him. The coroner, overworked and apathetic, declared the death a result of alcohol poisoning. No one questioned it. Emiliano's precision was increasing, his confidence growing. He was learning to dance with death, to lead it where he wanted, without ever revealing his presence on the floor. Invisibility was, indeed, his greatest weapon. It was on the third death that the legend began to take shape. The target was a low-level lieutenant, responsible for extorting local merchants. He was found in his car, inside his garage, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning, apparently a suicide or a stupid accident. The police barely investigated, but on the dashboard, perfectly centered, was a small cloth doll, identical to the one Anna always carried. This was not a mistake or an oversight. It was a statement. It was the first time Emiliano's shadow had materialized, leaving a tangible mark of its presence. The message was clear. These were not random deaths. There was a hunter in the streets of Juárez, and he was just getting started. The appearance of the doll sent a wave of unease through the ranks of El Sombra's gang. What were once tragic accidents now seemed like omens. Conversations in bars fell silent when the topic arose. Superstitions and ancient fears began to surface. There was talk of a curse, of the ghost of a murdered girl seeking revenge. El Sombra, arrogant and skeptical, laughed at the stories, punishing anyone who showed fear. Yet even he felt a pang of unease. The coincidence was too disturbing. Someone or something was challenging his power, not with guns and open violence, but with whispers and symbols, a type of psychological warfare he didn't understand, and therefore didn't know how to fight. It was against this backdrop of growing paranoia that Detective Isabella Rios arrived at the Juárez precinct. Transferred from Monterrey, she was an anomaly, honest, relentless, and with a stubborn faith in justice. Cases filed as accidents were tossed on her desk as a way to keep her busy and away from the real problems of corruption. But Rios saw what others ignored. 3 deaths, all connected to El Sombra, all seeming too natural. She began to connect the dots, to trace a pattern that no one else cared to look for. Her investigation was not about finding a criminal, but about unraveling a mystery, a shadow that moved through the city, leaving a trail of bodies and cloth dolls. While the detective searched for patterns, the people of the neighborhood created a myth. The unexplained deaths of criminals gave rise to a legend whispered in the alleys and markets. They called him El Duende Vengador, the vengeful elf. The name, a mixture of folklore and fear, captured the essence of the vigilante: small, elusive, supernatural. To some, he was an angel of death sent to cleanse the city. To others, a demon who would bring even more violence. Emiliano, hidden in his basement, heard the rumors and understood the power he was creating. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He was a symbol, a catalyst for the repressed fear and hope of an entire community. But with every life he took, a piece of his own soul was eroded. Anna's face haunted his dreams, no longer with the smile he loved, but with a sad, questioning gaze. Revenge was not bringing him peace, only a hollow emptiness. He saw himself repeating the tactics of his oppressors, the use of fear, calculated violence. The line between justice and revenge was becoming dangerously blurred, and he wondered if, by hunting the monster, he was only creating a new, even more terrifying one within himself. The fight against El Sombra was an external battle, but the real war was waged in the silence of his own conscience, a struggle not to lose himself completely in the darkness he had created. Seeking to hit El Sombra in a more profound way, Emiliano changed tactics. His next target would not be a man, but the cartel's cash flow. He discovered the location of a warehouse where a large shipment of drugs was being prepared to cross the border. Using his chemical knowledge, he didn't plan a robbery, but an act of sabotage. During the night, he infiltrated the site and contaminated the shipment with a compound that would render it useless and traceable. The operation was a success. The financial loss was massive, but the real blow was to El Sombra's reputation. He looked weak, vulnerable. The shadow hunting him now not only killed, but also thought and strategized. Father Mateo, from his old church, felt the change in the neighborhood's atmosphere. In the confessional, he heard the fears of the henchmen and the hopeful prayers of the oppressed. Everyone spoke of El Duende. The priest had known Emiliano since he was a child, knew his pain and his intelligence. He connected the dots, and his heart filled with a deep sorrow. He began to use his sermons to speak of forgiveness and the danger of vengeance, hoping his voice would reach the lost boy he knew. He left the church door unlocked late into the night, a silent offer of sanctuary, praying that Emiliano would seek salvation before it was too late for his soul. One night, Emiliano answered the silent call. He entered the confessional, his small figure hidden in the darkness. Father Mateo, sensing his presence, began to speak, not as a priest, but as an old friend. He begged Emiliano to stop, not to let the hatred consume him. From the other side of the screen, Emiliano's voice sounded hoarse and strange, as if it hadn't been used in years. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He questioned, "Where was God when they killed my sister, Father? Where is the justice in this world you defend?" That moment, in that sacred space, was the peak of his loneliness and his rebellion. He was making choices no one else could make, on a path he would have to walk alone. And it's the solitude of these decisive moments that forces us to act. If you feel the weight of his journey, know that your support by subscribing helps us continue to illuminate these stories of solitary struggles. Detective Rios, meanwhile, made a breakthrough. Investigating Ana Cortez's life, she discovered the old police reports for bullying, all mentioning Emiliano and Ricardo El Sombra Morales. She found an old class photo. In it, a small boy with sad eyes looked at the camera, while a young Ricardo smiled arrogantly in the background. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The vigilante was not a supernatural monster. He was a victim everyone had forgotten. Rios's hunt changed in nature. It was no longer just about catching a killer, but about finding a ghost, a broken soul, before his crusade of vengeance destroyed him completely or turned him into a martyr. With the pressure mounting, El Sombra became increasingly erratic. Distrust spread through his organization like a cancer. He saw traitors in every shadow, heard the name El Duende in every whisper. His brutality, once a tool of control, became indiscriminate. He executed 2 of his own men based on unfounded rumors, believing they were informants. Emiliano's psychological warfare was working perfectly. He didn't need to destroy the entire gang. He just needed to give El Sombra the tools to make it implode on its own. The cartel, once a monolith of power, was fracturing under the weight of its own paranoia. The danger for Emiliano also increased. During a reconnaissance mission near El Sombra's headquarters, he triggered a makeshift alarm. Suddenly, the dark alley was flooded with lights and armed men. Panic froze his blood. For an instant, He thought it was the end, but instinct, sharpened by a lifetime of hiding, took over. He used his stature to his advantage, slipping into a narrow sewer duct too small for any of his pursuers. As he listened to the frustrated shouts above, he realized how close he had come to death. The experience didn't scare him. It focused him. Time was running out. He needed to accelerate his endgame. Detective Rios, following her intuition, visited the abandoned Cortez home. The place was covered in dust, a mausoleum of an interrupted life. In Emiliano's small room, she found drawings, books, and an old diary. The pages revealed a sensitive and intelligent boy who dreamed of being an architect and who loved his sister more than anything. She saw the humanity behind the myth of El Duende. This solidified her resolve. She had to find him, not just to enforce the law, but to try to offer an alternative to the cycle of violence that was consuming him. She left her card on top of the diary, a small and perhaps futile hope that he might return and see that someone cared. Emiliano's next step was his boldest yet. He decided to isolate El Sombra by eliminating his right-hand man, a man named Hector, the tactical brain of the operation. He would not use poison or accidents. He needed to send an unequivocal message, using information he had. Gathered, he forged a note, making it look like Hector was planning a betrayal. He lured Hector to an abandoned warehouse with the promise of a meeting with a rival buyer. There, instead of a buyer, Hector found a trap. Emiliano, using the environment to his advantage, managed to incapacitate him and carry out his sentence. The death was quick, but the scene he left behind was designed to terrify. Hector's body was found the next morning in the middle of the neighborhood square, a place where everyone could see there were no signs of a struggle, just a single precise wound, and in his hand, placed firmly, was the familiar cloth doll. The audacity of the act shocked everyone. El Duende was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was claiming the heart of El Sombra's territory. The message to the cartel leader was brutally clear. You are not safe anywhere. Your men cannot protect you. I am coming for you. The fear in the neighborhood reached its peak, a heavy silence awaiting the final storm. The community's reaction was a mirror of its desperation. Some residents in secret began to light candles in their windows, not for saints, but for El Duende, their avenging angel. They saw him as the only form of justice they would ever know. Others, however, feared the escalation. The open war between the vigilante and the cartel meant more blood, more stray bullets, more danger for their children. The neighborhood, once united in its silent suffering, was now fractured by hope and fear. Emiliano, who began his journey to avenge a single person, was now the epicenter of a conflict that threatened to consume them all. The weight of his actions began to crush Emiliano. The nights were the worst. He no longer dreamed of Anna. Instead, he saw the faces of the men he had killed, their empty eyes staring at him in the darkness of his basement. The line he had drawn in the sand between himself and them was disappearing. The revenge he had imagined would bring a sense of closure had only left him emptier, more isolated. The memory of his sister's smile, the reason for it all, was becoming hard to recall clearly, overshadowed by the images of his own atrocities. He was winning the war, but he was losing himself in the process. Detective Rios felt the pressure from all sides. Her superiors wanted her to close the case, to arrest anyone to calm the situation. The residents didn't trust her, and she knew she was in a race against time. Analyzing Emiliano's psychology, the symbolism of the doll, and the locations of the deaths, she began to anticipate his next move. He was in a cycle, and all cycles eventually returned to their point of origin. She realized the final confrontation would not happen in a cartel safe house or on a random street. It had to be in a place of deep personal significance. It had to be in the alley where it all began. With El Sombra's organization in tatters and its leader isolated by paranoia, Emiliano set the stage for the final act. He knew Ricardo's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He sent an anonymous message, a direct challenge. The message contained details that only someone present on the night of Anna's death could know, and it promised a final, face-to-face confrontation with the ghost that haunted him. The meeting place, the same alley where Anna's life was taken. It was bait, and Emiliano knew that El Sombra, desperate to restore his honor and eliminate this threat, would take it. The trap was set. The night of vengeance had finally arrived. El Sombra arrived at the alley like a king inspecting his domain. Arrogance was his armor. He left his men at the entrance, ordering that no one follow him. He wanted the pleasure of crushing this ghost with his own hands. He entered the narrow passage, the cold, stagnant air enveloping him like a shroud. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps on the gravel. The brick walls, covered in faded graffiti, seemed to close in on him. For the first time in years, El Sombra felt a chill of uncertainty, a primal sense that he was entering the lair of something far older and more patient than himself. He drew his gun, the metallic click sounding profanely loud in the sepulchral silence. The moment he reached the center of the alley, the world exploded. A deafening detonation at the entrance sealed the passage with an avalanche of rubble and twisted metal, trapping him. Simultaneously, the few lights that illuminated the place flickered and died, plunging him into near absolute darkness. Panic began to bubble in his chest. He was blind, cornered. Then a single light switched on at the end of the alley, a weak spotlight that illuminated a small, makeshift shrine on the ground, exactly on the spot where Anna had fallen. The rest of the alley remained in impenetrable blackness. The hunt was over. The trap had been sprung. The predator, for the first time in his life, had become the prey. "You don't remember me, do you, Ricardo?" The voice echoed from the shadows, calm and devoid of emotion. It was not the voice of a ghost, but of a man, Emiliano. The realization hit Ricardo like a physical blow, stronger than any explosion. That name, the name of the dwarf he had tormented his whole life, the image of the helpless boy, collided violently with the reality of the methodical hunter who had dismantled him. It was impossible. The humiliation of that revelation was overwhelming, his fury mixed with a genuine terror. The monster haunting him was not a demon or a vengeful spirit. It was the result of his own cruelty, returned to collect the debt in full. The battle that followed was not one of strength, but of shadows and sound. Emiliano's voice assailed him from all directions, an unseen judge listing his sins. He recounted every extortion, every life destroyed, culminating in the details of the night Anna was murdered. "She was nothing to you," the voice hissed, "but she was my entire world." El Sombra, driven mad by fear and rage, began firing blindly into the darkness, the muzzle flashes revealing only brick walls and garbage. Each wasted bullet was a cry of impotence. Emiliano, moving with an agility born from an intimate knowledge of every inch of that alley, remained untouched, a spectre orchestrating the psychological collapse of his enemy. Taking advantage of Ricardo's blind fury, Emiliano began his physical assault. It was not a direct confrontation, but a series of hit-and-run attacks. Wires stretched in the dark tripped him. Heavy objects previously positioned on the ledges of buildings fell near him, disorienting him. A small pepper charge exploded near his face, temporarily blinding him. These were the tactics of a guerrilla, the same tactics of humiliation Ricardo had used against him for years, now returned with lethal precision. Wounded, coughing, and stumbling in the darkness, El Sombra was systematically broken, his body being punished while his mind was already in ruins. The brute force that had always been his greatest advantage was useless here. Finally, disarmed and bleeding from several cuts, Ricardo collapsed. Emiliano emerged from the darkness, his small figure seeming gigantic in the tense atmosphere. He stood over the man who had destroyed his life. The hatred in his chest was a furnace, crying out for one last act of violence. He raised a sharpened piece of rebar, the perfect weapon for a brutal and deserved end. Their eyes met, and in Ricardo's face. He saw not a monster, but a pathetic, defeated and terrified man, and in that moment the image of Anna came to his mind, not the image of her lifeless body, but of her smile. To kill him like this would make him just like him. His transformation demanded more than simple vengeance. With a cry that was more of pain than of rage, Emiliano threw the rebar aside. The sound of metal hitting the ground was the sound of his choice. As the police sirens drawn by the explosion grew closer, he executed his final act. He dragged Ricardo into the circle of the spotlight. Next to El Sombra's defeated body, he placed the gun that killed Hector and a tape recorder playing Ricardo's blubbered confession from during their confrontation. The moment Detective Rios and her officers stormed the alley, they found their target perfectly prepared for justice. Emiliano, his work done, had already vanished, melting back into the shadows from which he had emerged. A ghost who chose the law instead of blood. The capture of Ricardo El Sombra Morales sent shockwaves through Ciudad Juárez. The police, led by Detective Rios, dismantled the rest of the organization, now headless and plunged into chaos. In the alley, as forensics collected the meticulously planted evidence, Rios looked up at the dark rooftops surrounding the scene. She saw nothing, but she felt a presence. She knew El Duende had been there and that, in his final moment of absolute power, he had chosen a different path from his enemy. Official justice prevailed, but everyone knew the real victory belonged to a ghost. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief for the first time in a decade, celebrating the end of a tyrant without ever knowing the face of their true liberator. From a distant building, Emiliano watched the flashing lights of the patrol cars dance across the city.